It's a very great pleasure to welcome, or rather, very great pleasure to have sort of snatched Hal Foster from a kind of series of papers that he's giving over these few days. He needs kind of no introduction from me, as I'm sure most of you know and have read his work. He is one of America's most intelligent art and cultural critics, whose most recent work on surrealism, compulsive beauty, and his kind of rereading of the historical avant-garde and the return of the real represents, I think, a kind of incredibly novel and persuasive view of contemporary art practice. So he will introduce his own topic this evening, and is particularly concerned that we can turn this into a discussion as well. I'd like to welcome very much Hal Foster.
Okay. Whoa. You know, I have spoke for the last few nights in a row, so I'm reluctant to talk at you. I'd really like to talk with you. That's in part, well, there are two reasons. One, I know that you have another lecture here at 6:30, so I want to come and go fairly quickly. The other reason is that my subject is not entirely clear to me. I mean, I do want to talk about this notion of a structural impulse in contemporary practice. But I want to get there through a representation of a debate that I think will interest you as primarily, I assume, an architectural audience. And that is a debate that I think will continue for the next few years at least in the States, and I assume here too. I would be interested in the differences in these debates around the problem of visual culture. And I have a series of theses almost that I will want to read to you. But one way that I thought I might represent this debate, or at least one moment in this debate, is to reconstruct an issue of October that I did last year with Rosalind Krauss. And I will tell you, how we came to pose the questions that we did. I'll read we sent out a questionnaire, and I will read you the questions, and then I would like to read these theses. But I think why I decided that I wanted to talk about this question of visual culture here is that I think the status of architecture is involved, the status of art, and also the histories and theories of these practices. And it's not clear to me exactly what this field of visual culture might be. I'm not sure to what extent it should be resisted, to what extent embraced, but I want to present my sense of this field, and then perhaps we can talk about what the ramifications might be. So let me begin with I'll just read you the first paragraph of our introduction that Rosalind and I wrote, and then the questions, which are very brief, which structured our thinking about this issue. This, by the way, is October 77. It was summer 1996 issue. And then I'll read, in effect, my response, or my set of responses to the questions that we posed. So here's just an extract from our introduction. And I need to impress upon you that visual culture is, not even on the horizon on the States. It's part of our our landscape now, academically and otherwise. And again, what it involves, I think, is important to think through. Anyway, this extract. Visual culture does double service. It is both a partial description of a social world mediated by commodity images and visual technologies, and an academic rubric for interdisciplinary convergences among art history, architectural history, film theory, media analysis, and cultural studies. Now, cultural studies in the States means a quite different thing from cultural studies in this country, and perhaps we can trace these genealogies too. Some respondents to our questionnaire focus on the first apparition, the social world, the general economy of visual culture, while others concentrate on the second, the discursive relation of visual culture to other academic disciplines. Of course, the academic discourse may respond to the social phenomenon, but it also has its own imperatives, both theoretical and institutional, which some of the essays that are in the issue work to disclose. Whether one welcomes the notion or dismisses it, visual culture is likely to remain, and this issue of October offers an initial account of its uses and abuses, its premonitions in art history and architectural history, its affinities with anthropological discourse, its resonances in contemporary art, architecture, and criticism, and its ramifications for various institutions. Then we go on to wonder about this extraordinary new event in the life of the Guggenheim, where last summer they opened up new galleries downtown, or renewed galleries downtown in the Soho branch, where Deutsche Telekom was basically given not only the space for its name, but also the program. They gave over these galleries to its representation of its media interests. So there's no pretense anymore, at least in this aspect of this particular museum, of a public culture apart from direct corporate interests. And this is obviously part of the world that we need to negotiate. Anyway, this is the questionnaire that we asked. And again, these questions are also rhetorical for my theses that I will relay to you. And these were meant to be contradictory, these questions, or at least somewhat conflictual internally. Number one, it has been suggested that the interdisciplinary project of visual culture is no longer organized on the model of history, as were the disciplines of art history, architectural history, film history, and so on, but on the model of anthropology. Hence, it is argued by some that visual culture is in an eccentric, even at times antagonistic position with regard to the new art history. These are quotation marks, with its social, historical, and semiotic imperatives and models of context and text. Number two, it has been suggested that visual culture embraces the same breadth of practice that powered the thinking of an early generation of art and architectural historians, such as Riegel and Warburg, and that to return the various medium-based historical disciplines, such as art, architecture, and cinema histories, to this earlier intellectual possibility is vital to their renewal. Now, another thing that we might want to talk about is strange interest in the Warburgian tradition in art and architectural history, why people like Abby Warburg are again of enormous interest to young historians and theorists. Three, it has been suggested that the precondition for visual studies as an interdisciplinary rubric is a newly wrought conception of the visual as disembodied image, recreated in the virtual spaces of sign exchange and phantasmatic projection. Further, if this new paradigm of the image originally developed in the intersection between psychoanalytic and media discourses, it has now assumed a role independent of specific media. As a corollary, the suggestion is that visual studies is helping in its own modest academic way to produce subjects for the next stage of globalized capital. And just as an aside, that's Rosalind, not me, that last sentence. I take no credit. Four, it has been suggested that pressure within the academy to shift toward the interdisciplinarity of visual culture, especially in its anthropological dimension, parallel shifts of a similar nature within art, architectural, and film practices of the present. So I hope you will keep these questions or these statements, contradictory as they may be with each other, in mind as you listen to my extended responses. And if you're interested, I could also relate some of the other responses too. Anyway, I want to pass on these little theses to provoke discussion. I assume it will take me about a half an hour to go through them. I hope that's okay. But essentially, there are several sections, and if you look for connections, you may be at a loss. Anyway, the first section, or the first thesis, is called Conditions of Possibility. In 1928, in an essay on the formal method in European art scholarship, Mikhail Bakhtin associated the becoming academic of art history at the end of the 19th century with the becoming autonomous of modernist art during the same time. In particular, he related two aspects of this history to two attributes of that art: its foregrounding of the constructive aspect of the artwork and its attention to alien art in an imperialist age. Indirectly, the first, this attention to the constructive, the formal, oriented art history to formal questions, as with Heinrich Wölfflin. And the second, this interest in alien art, which flooded into the European metropoles under the imperial epoch. The second impulse oriented art history to different Kunstvollens, or artistic wills, this idea that different cultures have different forms, as with Riegel. Now, might the discourse of visual culture at the end of the 20th century depend on two parallel preconditions: on the foregrounding of the visual virtuality of contemporary media, and on the attention to cultural multiplicity in a post-colonial age. A third parallel might be proposed straight away. Art history as a discipline, its modern foundation. Art history relied on techniques of reproduction to abstract a wide range of objects into a system of style, as defined in diacritical terms, most famously by Wölfflin in the Principles of Art History of 1915. You'll remember open versus closed composition, linear versus painterly technique, and so on. Or, to take another example of a system, in Cross-Cultural Affinities by André Malraux in the Museum Without Walls, which began in 1935, the first version of The Voices of Silence, which was published in 1951. Might visual culture rely on techniques of information now, not reproduction, to transform a wide range of mediums now into a system of image text, a database of digital terms, an archive without museums? Already apparent in the pedagogy of the lantern slide, the discursive effects of photographic reproduction were not thought through until the 1930s, until, that is, people like Benjamin. What are the electronic preconditions of visual culture, and how long will it take us to grasp the epistemological implications? Okay, the next thesis is quite short. These are not really theses. These are more, I don't know what to call them, ruminations, I guess. Next section is called Antinomies of Visual Culture. As a partial social description, visual culture seems almost commonsensical, suspect though common sense is. As a general academic rubric, it is less obvious, more oxymoronic than art history. Certainly its two terms repel each other with more force. For if art history is strained between the autonomy of its first term, art, and the imbrication of its second, history, visual culture is riven by the virtuality of its first term, visual, and the materiality of its second, culture. One way to draw out these nominal implications is to trace the shift from art to visual and history to culture. That is, to take these substitutions seriously. The next section is called Culture Envy. The shift from history to culture intimates a shift, inadvertent or otherwise, to anthropology as a guardian discourse. Of course, art history was also involved with anthropology. The relation between the two is akin to a sibling rivalry, with moves to identify followed by moves to disidentify, to dissociate. Some critical historians, and by the critical historians I mean a la Michael Padro, of the great figures at the towards the close of the century, from Riegel, Warburg, Wolflin, onto Panofsky in particular. Some critical historians work to redefine artistic production in anthropological terms. Think of Riegel in particular, or Warburg as another example. Yet the immediate source of the ethnographic model in visual culture today remains cultural studies. And again, you have to remember that this term means differently in the States. Along with new historicism, cultural studies has prompted the turn from hierarchies of high and low art, or major and minor forms, to tabulations of images deemed more or less equal in value. The challenge to elitist hierarchies and traditional canons is important, but the transformation of art history into image history is also problematic. In its suspicion of art, it is not reflexive about its own omnibus category, the image. So too, its dismissal of aesthetic autonomy as retrograde and its embrace of popular forms as progressive is too automatic. More important, this transformation may not complicate historical counts so much as default on them. For in the ethnographic model, one moves horizontally from site to site across social space, more than vertically, in a discourse inscribed with a historicity, a responsibility of form of its own. In this way, the shift from history to culture, again as a guardian discourse, may promote in art, perhaps in architecture, you'll have to tell me, as well in the criticism of these practices, a post-historical reduction as often as a multi-historical complication. As the precedents of cultural studies and new historicism suggest, the ethnographic turn is not specific to visual culture. It pervades non-traditional work in art and academy alike, and it's important to understand why. First, anthropology addresses alterity, which makes it, along with psychoanalysis, the lingua franca of much art and theory today. Second, anthropology studies culture, and postmodernist practice has long claimed this expanded field of reference as its own. Third, anthropology is contextual, an often automatic value for contemporary artists and critics, many of whom aspire to field work in the everyday. Fourth, anthropology arbitrates the interdisciplinary, another often rote value. Remember, this is meant to be somewhat polemical. Finally, the self-critique of anthropology is attractive, for it promises a reflexivity of the ethnographer, often at the center still, even as it preserves a romanticism of the other, often still on the margins. Yet the ethnographic turn is clinched by another factor, which involves the double inheritance of anthropology. According to Marshall Solins, two epistemologies have long divided the discipline. One stresses the discipline of anthropology. One stresses symbolic logic with the social scene in terms of exchange systems. The other privileges practical reason with the social scene in terms of material culture. In this light, anthropology already participates in the two contradictory models that inform much art and criticism today. In the old ideology of the text, the linguistic turn that refigured the social as symbolic order and or cultural system and advanced the dissolution of man, the death of the author, and so on. And in the recent longing for the referent, the experiential turn to identity and community that often rejects these old subject critiques and these old text paradigms. With a move to the split discourse, then, artists and critics can resolve these contradictory models magically. They can take up the guises of cultural semiologist and contextual field worker. They can continue and condemn critical theory. They can relativize and recenter the subject, all at the same time. In our state of theoretical ambivalences and political impasses, anthropology becomes the compromised discourse of choice. The next section is called Image Epiphany. Just as anthropological assumptions and social imperatives govern the shift from history to culture, so psychoanalytic assumptions and technological imperatives govern the shift from art to visual. Again, I want to trace these nominal shifts from art to visual and history to culture. Here the image is to visual culture what the text was to post-structural practices. An analytic that reveals the object in new ways, but sometimes to the detriment of materiality and historicity. For especially in visual culture that develops out of film and media studies, the image is often treated as a projection in the psychological register of the imaginary, the technological register of the simulacral, or both. That is, as a doubly immaterial phantasm. As with the longing for the cultural, this hypostasing, is that an English word? This hypostasis of the visual is active in art history too. Not only in its technology, again, think of how the photographic abstraction of the object allowed this idea of style, this Wolflinian idea of style, or even this Malroian idea of style to take over. This hypostasing of the visual is active in art history too, not only in its technology, but also in its teleology. For in one Regalian account of Regal, the story of art is a complicated, cyclical sublimation of the tactile into the optical. Here again, modernist art is not necessarily opposed to art history. For in one formalist account, this modernist art, also worked to purify the pictorial in terms of the optical. That is, to map the impressions of the retina onto the plane of the picture, pure and simple. Apart from its artistic interest, this purity has a social function to save modernist art from its corrupt double, mass culture. Yet the rarefying of optical effects and the fetishizing of visual signifiers are not foreign to capitalist spectacle. They are fundamental to it. So too, visual culture might advance more than resist further hypostatizing of the visual and disembodying of the viewer today. Okay, the next section is titled Archival Relations. Again, I'm sorry if these sections do not flow one into the other. There is a relation between visual culture and electronic information. How can it be thought outside of anxious affirmation or romantic revolution? One way is to invoke the archive as defined by Foucault, the system that governs the appearances of statements, and to ask what this new order might enable as well as disable. Thus Foucault described an archival relation, neither affirmative nor revolutionary, between Manet and the museum and Flaubert and the library. This is a famous moment. Every painting, he wrote, now belongs with the squared and massive surface of painting, in other words, the museum. And all literary works are confined to the indefinite murmur of words, that is, to literature with a capital L. As Flaubert explored this new space, Foucault suggests, he also defined it clearly enough that modernist successors like Joyce, Roussel, Kafka, Pound, Borges could challenge it. The library, Foucault concluded, is on fire with these figures. The same might be said of Manet and the museum, and with Picasso, Duchamp, Ernst, Twombly, Rauschenberg, the museum begins to burn as well. The further archival relation is demarcated, I think, by the Bauhaus. In its project to transform the work of art, the Bauhaus contested the archival relation of painting and museum, demarcated by Manet. Yet this contestation also facilitated the practical extension of the system of exchange value to the whole domain of signs, forms, and objects, as the early Baudrillard would suggest. In other words, the Bauhaus transgressed the old orders of art, but it also advanced the new principles of capitalist design, the political economy of the sign, to use the Baudrillardian phrase. In this way, each new archive both liberates and constrains, and each new transformation is both a transgressing and a trumping. Recuperation is not dialectical enough a notion to describe this event. Now, visual culture marks another archival transformation. It has its precedence then. Above all, the epochal event that informs both Manet in the imaginary space in the museum and the Bauhaus in the political economy of the sign. And that is, of course, the transformation of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, as disputed by Benjamin in the essay, the famous essay of 1936, and Malraux in The Voices of Silence. Remember, he begins it in 1935, this text. Benjamin argues that photographic reproduction, I'm sure we can all sing along, we know these formulas, strips art of context, shatters tradition, liquidates aura. Not only is cult value lost forever, but exhibition value is also threatened. And in lieu of these old and new rituals, a political refunctioning of art becomes possible, or so he hoped, rather naively, I think, at that point, 1936 or 1935. Out of the same archival event, Malraux files a very different report. If for Benjamin, exhibition value troubles art value, for Malraux, the museum guarantees art as such. Moreover, if for Benjamin, reproduction shatters tradition and liquidates aura, for Malraux, it provides the means to reassemble the broken bits into one meta-tradition of style, a new museum without walls, whose subject is the family of man. And it is the very flow of a liquidated aura that allows all the fragments to course together in the river of history. If you know the Museum Without Walls, The Voices of Silence, it's peppered is not the right word, it's dominated by phrases such as the persisting life of certain forms emerging ever and again like specters from the past. Together, Benjamin and Malraux describe a dialectics of seeing permitted by photographic reproduction. One must understand them as dialectical, not choose between them. Is there a new dialectics of seeing allowed by electronic information? If, according to Malraux, the museum guarantees the status of art and photographic reproduction permits the affinities of style, what might a digital reordering underwrite? Art as image text, as info pixel, an archive without museums? If so, will this database be more than a base of data, a repository of the given? Next section is called A New Alexandria. And I just have 2 or 3 more sections to go, and then we can talk. 30 years ago, to return to Foucault, in Les Mots, Les Choses, Foucault was prompted by a certain famous now Chinese encyclopedia in Borges. He was prompted by this encyclopedia to consider the epistemic order of things in different periods. Out of this monstrous encyclopedia of animals that disrupted the ageal distinction between the same and the other, Foucault made an allegory about a catastrophe in the very allegorical structure of knowledge, of words related to things in a spatial system. Here, he suggested the umbrella and sewing machine, the familiar objects from the surrealist definition of collage that find a place together on the operating table, no longer possess this operating table necessary to support their chance encounter. What is impossible, Foucault writes, is not the propinquity of the things listed, but the very side on which their propinquity would be possible. Now, for all appearances, this Borgesian disorder is our order. This post-surrealist heterotopia is our topos. And again, it is an event that both liberates and constrains. After photographic reproduction, the museum was not so bound by walls, but it was bordered by style. Again, this is the term that Malraux reinstates. What is the edge of the archive without museums? Perhaps its limit takes the form of an illusion, of a superficial mobility of signs that covers a profound stasis of system. Perhaps the library has returned, but as a container in which other orders are melted down and set in a deep freeze. An entropic archive, a new Alexandria. Speaking for being, as only he could, a Heidegger might regard this Alexandrian archive as the epitome of the standing reserve fundamental to all technology, of which man in the midst of objectlessness is nothing but the orderer. Speaking for the old world, like almost no one like he could, George Steiner might see it as the manifest destiny of America, the land not of open territories, but of museum malls that purchase and preserve the remnants of European cultures. To contest this Alexandrianism, however, one need not agree with these arch conservatives. One cannot agree with them. For this Alexandrianism is hardly complete, and it does permit other uses and abuses. Moreover, the avant-garde moves, as Greenberg argued in The Avant-Garde and Kitsch, another text to add to this constellation of texts from the late 1930s, while Alexandrianism stands still. And this precisely is what justifies the avant-garde's method and makes them necessary. This, I want to insist, remains the case today. Okay, there's two more sections. Next one is called Images Are Us. I don't know if you have Toys Are Us in this country, but you do? Okay, good. So my argument is that images are us now, it's not just toys. Secretly or otherwise, many discourses either model or mirror a subject. Concerned with judgment, refinement, and taste, aesthetics tends to a self-modeling, some secret modeling of the self, while art history tends to a self-mirroring. Certainly to proclaim the autonomy of the art object, as aesthetics and art history often do, is to project or to presuppose an autonomy of the art subject. And on this point, that art might reconcile opposed faculties and so demonstrate a freedom of mind, Kantian and Hegelian traditions in art history and architectural history agree. And the final stake is all of us as subjects, as autonomous subjects. Of course, this self-making can become forced, rigid, moralistic. The only means of access to artwork remains exaltation, that is, a feeling of moral obligation. Benjamin wrote of a disastrous experience of Wolflin in lecture in 1915. He does not see the artwork. He feels obliged to see it, demands that one see it, considers his theory a moral act. He becomes pedantic, ludicrously catatonic, and thereby destroys any natural talents that his audience may have. This is my favorite account of an art historical lecture. But this moral act can also enliven rather than embalm the subject, or so Michael Fried claimed 50 years later. While modernist painting has increasingly divorced itself from the concerns of the society in which it precariously flourishes, the actual dialectic by which it is made has taken on more and more of the denseness, structure, and complexity of moral experience. That is, of life itself, but life as few are inclined to live it, in a state of continuous intellectual and moral alertness. Now, this is Michael Fried in 1965, very young man. And again, perhaps it's as ridiculous a statement as the experience of Benjamin of Wolflin seemed ludicrous. But I think for however restrictive it may sound, it's an extraordinary account of one elitist version of late modernism. Okay. I mean, so my basic point is that art history, architectural history, aesthetic discourses in general want to propose a subject. The question is, what kind of subject? And the further question is, what ideal subject does visual culture model and or mirror? Far from autonomy, this discourse traces a chiasmus of subject and image. In the first equation of the chiasmus, the subject is defined not only as an image maker, but as an image. That the foundational act of our identity is an imaginary mimesis, an identification with an image, is also a basic tenet of psychoanalysis, which is one reason why psychoanalysis is so central to visual culture, but also one reason why it might reinforce rather than reveal the inflation of the imaginary in visual culture. The second equation of the chiasmus follows from the first. If the subject is now defined as an image, the image is now defined as a subject in its image. Like the first simile, this is a provocative thought experiment, but it confuses a psychic investment in an image with the investment of an image with a psyche, the subject effect of an image with the remaking of an image as a subject. Now this is problematic. I know this is condensed, this idea that somehow subjects are thought as images, and images now are thought as subjects. This is problematic because this chiasmus of subject and image is isomorphic with the structure of commodity fetishism as outlined by Marx. In the capitalist divorce of producer from product, the relation between people, according to Marx, takes on the fantastic form of a relation between things, and inanimate things take on the even more fantastic form of human agents, a confusion that recalls, at least it did for Marx, the misty realm of religion, where the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own. This confusion, which Marx figures as a visual projection, indeed as an imaginary misrecognition, is deepened in the commodity image fetishism of visual culture. Not only does this new fetishism obscure productive relations and material conditions like the old fetishism did, but it also renders this confusion more internal to the subject, almost constitutive of the subject. Rather than the misty realm of religion, the appropriate analogy may now be the digital animation of Hollywood. Dr. Dolittle crossed with Toy Stories. We talk to the images, and the images are us. This fetishistic anthropomorphism drives many discourses today. No longer just friendly, computers are interactive. Not just communication, the internet offers interconnectivity, and so on. Today, the pathetic fallacy is a technological truth, and per the structure of fetishism, the reverse must be considered as well, a technological fallacy whereby the machine projects its modalities into the subject. In this regard, consider the language of the electronic revolution. This rhetoric is less cyberpunk than techno-psychedelic, hence the hallucinogenic tropes of virtual reality. And I guess it was to be expected that Timothy Leary would make a comeback as a techno-guru. Or the aleatory tropes of the web, which is the new site of post-surrealist derives. Access is two-way. The epiphanic entrance to the information highway is promised as a euphoric exploration of the mind. This is not just clockwork orange paranoia. In the age of electronic information, a principal frontier of capitalism is the unconscious. For many of us, autonomy is a bad word, a ruse in aesthetic discourse, a deception in ego psychology, and so on. We forget that autonomy is a diacritical term like any other. It's defined in opposition in relation to its opposite, that is, to subjection. Historically, subjection is often figured in the primitivist terms of fetishism. Indeed, the African fetishist, this phantasm is almost always located in Africa, was an important foil for the enlightened European. Structurally, the irrational subjection of the former, the African fetishist, supported, even preceded, the rational autonomy of the latter, the enlightened European. Explicitly, for example, Charles de Brosse, who wrote very early on about fetishism, but explicitly for this guy, fetishism is an infantile cult that traps its worshippers in a perpetual childhood. Now, implicitly, in what is Enlightenment of 1784, Kant too saw fetishism in this way. It was the secret epitome of the self-incurred tutelage to be vanquished by the Enlightenment. Marx is part of this Enlightenment project too. His critique of commodity fetishism is also made in the name of autonomy, as is the Freudian critique of sexual fetishism, though Freud knew it could not be vanquished. As given to us by the Enlightenment, aesthetic autonomy is articulated against fetishistic enslavement as well. The orderly austerity of the Kantian artwork opposed to the sensuous seduction of the fetish. The disembodied disinterest of the Kantian viewer opposed to the embodied desire of the fetish worshiper. The sublimation of the Kantian object and subject alike to the perversion of fetish and fetishist alike. Often modernist artists and critics seize the fetish to challenge this aesthetics of autonomy. Marx once described fetishism as the religion of sensuous desire. This is a decent description of surrealism as well. Surrealism sought to inject desire into the aesthetic, to bind subject to object fetishistically. And to this end, it modeled the artwork not as an ideal ego integral in form, but as a part object of drives. Not cognitive disinterest, but libidinal investment. I defy any amateur of painting Bataille famously said, to love a picture as much as a fetishist loves a shoe. There are two problems with this anti-aesthetics of the fetish today. First, this dissonant position in modernism has become a dominant position in postmodernism. Once artists showed work, now they exhibit fetishes. There is no tradition of autonomy to subvert. Our tradition is surrealist. Second, the exploration of the unconscious is the project no longer of André Breton's alone, but of Bill Gates's as well. Of course, Chairman Bill, and I have to say that some of my extraordinary animosity to digital culture has to do with the fact that I grew up with Chairman Bill. Chairman Bill does not have a monopoly yet. Alternative explorations do exist. Nevertheless, the battlefield of Alexandria and avant-garde has changed today, and strategic aesthetics must be devised accordingly. Again, autonomy is a bad word, but we tend to forget that its use is politically situated. Enlightenment thinkers like Kant proclaimed autonomy in order to wrest institutions away from the Ancien Regime. Art historians like Riegel to resist deterministic accounts of art. Modernists from Manet to Donald Judd to challenge the priority of iconographic text, the necessity of illustrational meanings, the imperialism of mass media, the overburdening of art with voluntaristic politics, and so on. Like essentialism, autonomy is a bad word, but it may not always be a bad strategy. Call it strategic autonomy. So that's the end of those, this set of what I hope to be provocations, but I do feel that we need to contend with this kind of strange new field of visual culture and to find our way, our place in it and our way through it, perhaps. So I'd love to hear your comments or questions or critiques or anything at all. In particular, perhaps where you think architecture stands in this landscape. Oops, sorry. It's a tentative hand. Uh-huh. Well, I guess the first thing I should say is that if you look to October to be consistent, let alone coherent, that will not come true. I mean, I think my thoughts on the need to rethink terms like not medium specificity, but structural autonomy in artistic practice, architectural practice, across the field of visual culture, is in a way at odds with this other term, perhaps as you suggested, this other interest in this surrealist tradition of the inform, the abject, and so on. For me, or at least for October, it seems that these two poles have emerged in some version of an opposition, and this is perhaps one way that we have groped to define a field. But I've become, I guess to use a consumerist term, a little fatigued with this interest in the whole form and the abject. I think I know what it is about, at least in its American artistic manifestations. And I've become more interested in artists that want to relate cognitively to the world and also want to think about a restructuring of the aesthetic field rather than to simply sit back in the kind of gloried indulgence of the abject. I'm not sure that was a response to your question, but that's how I see it at this point in time anyway. Well, look, I think that one of the givens of this moment, of this time, is that we are in a condition of the post-medium. Whether that means the post-discipline or not, I'm not so sure. The debates with Greenberg around the question of modernism, around the question of postmodernism, tended to be staged on the forum of the medium, right? Then it seemed important to resist the constrictions of the medium and the constraints of the discipline because the aesthetic field was so restrictively defined. And because it was restrictively defined, I think there was the possibility in an early moment of postmodernism of transgression, at least aesthetic transgression, whether it ramified elsewhere, I'm not so sure. And then when this transgression seemed entropic, there was the project of the deconstruction of these mediums, the deconstruction of these disciplines. There too, that's a project that continues to interest me, but I think it again, to use a consumerist term perhaps, is somewhat fatigued. And I think the aesthetic field is not in a way very ordered now. And I believe in order in a way. This is not really a return to order, but I think that we're a call for such. But I think that to do complicated work in art, in architecture, in fiction, in film, whatever your practice might be, you have to have a structure resistant enough so that you can articulate complicated meanings, feelings, thoughts, whatever. And I don't think that there isn't such an aesthetic field with much resistance now. This is part of my critique of cultural studies, or this anthropological turn, as I call it. So I think that with Greenberg, we had a very restrictive definition of the aesthetic field. Now, we have a very falsely liberated one, a formless one. And so the question is not so much about the medium, the transgression of the medium, for me at least, it is what counts in a post-medium age, what counts as structure enough to do serious work. And I would think that would be a concern for architects too. I have a sense that the young artists, young architects, this is not just my conservatism out loose again. Some of these thoughts are pressured by young friends who ask me, what is the specificity of the artistic now, of the architectural? God forbid, what is the autonomy of these practices? They don't mean these terms. These terms cannot mean what they did for Kant, let alone for Greenberg, or for Greenberg, let alone for Kant. They come back, if they will come back at all, totally transformed, I think.
Right. Maybe it is like different sides of the Atlantic, because I don't have any objection to the term kind of museum culture as a sort of vague descriptive kind of area. But what seems kind of wrong with its kind of institutionalization of it
Right.
As it were, it's as if certain problems about what used to be called psychology and perception, together with certain sort of Durkheimian problems which used to be called collective representation, together with an art historical notion of sort of differential kind of art practices, have finally all found their culturally relative, the one term which will give them their cultural kind of relativism. And I think that profoundly kind of overlooks what we might call not the problem of the interdisciplinary, but actually the limits of disciplines.
Right, right.
Limits of disciplines in the sense that problems don't all kind of constitute like a single problem, that a discipline can and actually needs to be a discipline to think something through.
Right.
But there isn't another space where they can simply be summarized into a kind of homogeneous form. I was thinking, I mean, like you, I wonder why, sometimes that field sometimes, refers to Warburg, as if Warburg was sort of part of the genealogy. Now, actually, kind of Warburg, has a distinctive program study, a distinctive problem. A problem which is actually very interesting, although it seemed completely wacky if you told people what it was.
Right.
So why certain classical images have enough demonic force in them to last into the modern world. That's not me doing that too well. Annual visual culture conference. I mean, it's really like a plea for maintaining a certain kind of separated madness of individual questions from each other.
Yeah, but let me just say one more thing in terms of the question of Greenberg and the question of medium discipline. I mean, not only are we in a post-medium moment, I think we're also in a moment where the interdisciplinary is not an automatic value. And I think that this move is necessary, out of disciplines, from within, out of disciplines. And, I'm not sure that I was part of a generation that was trained enough in a discipline to be properly interdisciplinary. I think you have to know at least one, if not two, disciplines to be interdisciplinary. I mean, this is commonsensical, no? My sense is that students now, at least in the States, have moved to the interdisciplinary before they pass through the disciplinary. So rather than interdisciplinary work, which you often have is adisciplinary, non-disciplinary work. And, at good moments it's a provocative bricolage. At bad moments it's a really entropic pastiche. And that too I think should be guarded against. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Well, I think this is part of the problem, and I am anxious about my formulations because I think there's a dimension to my line of thought that is reactive or conservative. I think there's also an important value to the conservative, but I don't want this to be taken as a return to order. But I think that example suggests in part what is at stake. So I think that there, again, in this post-medium age, perhaps post-discipline age, what counts as tradition, what counts as memory, what counts as the madness of a discipline, the demonic force of the images that so interested Warburg, for example, it's not clear if these things are conveyed anymore in form, it seems to me. I think, how can I say this? To take the example of modern painting, for centuries, there was a repetition structure in European painting of the West, that it was part of the academic production, whereby artists, painters not only imitated prior models, but alluded to them in a way that elaborated them almost subliminally. And they could assume this kind of mnemonic function in painting that was inscribed in the images, in the forms. And this is one version of tradition. Now, clearly we want to critique this restrictive notion of tradition. But I wonder if we want to give up on it altogether. Clearly we want to critique it, we want to complicate it with other traditions. But I wonder what happens when we lose the idea of the historicity of forms. Maybe they're gone now. Maybe we shouldn't be nostalgic about them. Maybe we're in a moment where you do have to assign meanings, perhaps literally. But I would hope that there was a way to kind of ask again what structure, what form might be in a way that would not be merely structural, merely formalist. If there's a way for Libeskind to make meaning in a way that's not just an imposition of his own code onto his own buildings. But I think that signals the situation in many different practices. And I think that's, in a way we have a different anxiety from the anxiety of influence. We have an anxiety of no influence whatsoever. Right. 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 Yeah, no, I think, that's terrific to have a source for this shift, if it is one. For me, there's another citation that I will just pass on. Artists of the generation of Judd, say, of Donald Judd, were so oppressed by the criterion of quality as held by Greenberg, and quality meant a measure against the old masters and the great moderns. Quality was precisely about this mnemonic function of painting and sculpture, that it could elaborate the forms of the tradition and stand the test of time. They were so burdened by this idea of quality that they posed interest too, as a different criterion. Judd said at one point, I think in 1965, in the famous short text, Specific Object. He said, art need only be interesting. And for me too, that's the signal of a certain break with a historical reference, perhaps a disciplinary reference, God knows a very restrictive reference, into a realm of the cultural, of the anthropological, where the goal is to be provocative only. And I want to, I want to hold on to both axes. I would like to develop a third term that is neither simply qualitative, nor simply one of interest, of provocation. And I'm not exactly sure what that might mean, but I think that the generation of people like Judd were able to hold those two forces in tension, in part because they still had this sense of a tradition. I mean, they wanted to negate it, but to negate is also to preserve and to carry on, in another way. And I'm not sure that this negation has the force of this preservation too. So I'm interested to develop some other term besides quality and besides interest. I don't know what it might be.
Seems to be, in a certain kind of architectural discourse, what you see referred to, like it has that term, is when people talk about architectural effect. The problem of using it is then they have no captain or any other way of distinguishing the architectural effect from some other effect.
Right.
Nor a theory of causality which distinguishes cause and effect, nor, as it were, a theory of psychology which just wants to kind of give account of effects. But nonetheless, I think the use of that term, architectural effect, precisely because it isn't under the basis of difficulty being elaborated, but marks the call for precisely what we're saying. It is needed. It's not. It has not as yet worked through kind of form. It's a promise, but it seems to kind of diagnose the same situation.
I don't know. I would be interested to know what, if the anxiety that I feel among young artists, young architects in the States is also felt here in terms of, what counts. Why are you? Maybe this is not a question I should ask as a guest, but why are you at the AA rather than, say, at an art school? Or, what is specific about the architectural for you now that, in terms of its practice, as you see it defined, that makes you want to have your intervention be called architectural? I mean, in my experience, mostly with artists in New York and at a program called the Whitney Program, which is in a way is, I think, kind of equivalent to the AA in terms of art practice in New York. I've sensed, after years of this anthropological model where I felt like I just explored from studio to studio and had to learn a whole new language with each new turn, that there's a new convergence around these questions. And these questions are not simply about tradition in any old sense or medium in any old sense. They're about what counts as a specific practice. Are we just in a world of different kinds of effects that are labeled architectural or photographic or digital or painterly? Or is there weight to these terms? I know it's a hell of a question to ask. In terms of the tectonic? Yeah. Yeah. And what are the responses of the judges here? I won't tell. I mean, is this persuasive for you? Or do you see it more as a signal of an anxiety about the need for such a term, or the need for such a basis? Hmm. Right. Let's see. Yeah. No, no. That's the short answer. No, again, I mean, it's grandiose to call these things theses, but part of my project in these notes was to suggest that if we are in a new archival relation of terms, this new archive is one that both enables and disables. I mean, I don't think it, it's only, one can only be euphoric. I mean, there was a euphoric moment, God knows, when we were reprogrammed around the computer as our core commodity. And I'm sure this was the case here. It was brutal in the States. It began in like the early 80s, and there was not a single program on television or any other media where you were not somehow trained, secretly or not, to become good computer subjects. And that continues. But I think that it has to be seen, perhaps not dialectically, but in both ways at once. As a new regime that enables and disables at the same time. I think one thing that these digital or these technological pressures do is that they force the question about structure. I don't mean necessarily structure in a tectonic sense, but I mean structure in the sense of practices. For example, what is an image now? It's not clear to me. When you see an image that you think is photographic, it may not be photographic in the old indexical sense. It may be it may be digital, which is to say that it might have an archive behind the image where montage is made internal to the image. And I think because there's a profound dis-ease around what an image is now, that this sort of structural impulse that I see in contemporary art, maybe contemporary architecture, is also forced by this question. And it's one way that artists and perhaps architects may be able to intervene now, because I think in the phenomenology of contemporary images, it's not at all clear what images are, where they begin, where they end, to what extent they're pictorial, photographic, electronic. It's unclear. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, obviously, I think you would have, it sounds like you would have more to say on the subject than I can right now, but I would say this. I mean, I'm very interested in psychoanalysis in different forms thereof. I'm not no expert. But I do think that a certain tendency in psychoanalytical models to inflate the imaginary has contributed to this apotheosis of the image that I think is at the root of visual culture, where everything is treated as an image. And I think it's, in a way that the idea of the text was a passport to fairly flagrant interdisciplinary work the last, 2 decades. There's a way in which the image has the same status now. It's the passport by which people, from very different practices think that they can comment on visual culture. I mean, it's extraordinary now. I mean, the art people who are trained in art history, art criticism, are more and more the last people that are asked to comment on the works of visual culture. In part, I think that has to do with, this is maybe where I am territorial, this inflation of the image, as simulacral. So any idea of the psychoanalytic that would insist perhaps on the object, too, although I know in Winnicott the object is an image as well, might be helpful. But again, I don't know enough to say. There we go. Thank you for coming.